Okay, great. Thank you. We had a stimulating first half. We'll have a somewhat shorter second half and aim to finish by 5 o'clock, and then get ready for a party up in our in the Abraham Shapiro Academic Complex to follow. So I did want to start. We ended with a student perspective, but I do want to start also the second half by kind of asking us to focus and we talked a lot about engagement with outside communities and but I think it would be good to think about the issues of threats to democracy, specifically in relation to our students, and the extent to which higher education should make a conscious attempt to instill values of democratic citizenship as a part of its mission. Is that something we should be focused on? If so, what exactly does that mean? What responsibilities do students themselves have to mobilizing resources inside or outside the university to support democracy? I thought I might start by turning to Elaine Wong and then figuring maybe Leah and or Jacob might want to speak specifically to students before we turn back to some of the other questions. Yeah, Elaine.
So again, as everybody has said before, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. One of the things that happens when you're on a panel with 13, 14 other people who are distinguished and accomplished is that you will often hear them say things that you had thought about yourself saying. So Dan had been kind enough to give us some of the questions he would be giving us, we would be discussing in advance, and I was really heartened to hear that some of the points that were raised were ones that I had been planning on raising myself. So I'm going to reiterate a couple of those and then just take it a tiny bit in a different direction. So for those of you who are joining us in the second half, Lee did a fabulous job of reminding us about what was discussed. But the points that I wanted to reiterate were one that Professor Shattuck had mentioned, which is how we really do need, as civic engagement, is one of the things that I think is essential, is to engage our students in voting. And I want to endorse also what Lisa Lynch said, how students really do need to be critical thinkers, who are fact checkers, who are really engaged in all of these questions. But for me, one of the things that I am always about is setting goals and then figuring out how we're going to measure whether we are achieving them. It's not just setting the goals, it's actually figuring out what are the steps to make these things happen. And we know that students, younger people tend to vote less. But one of the reasons why they tell us they vote less is not just, oh, I'm too lazy. They don't believe it matters sometimes. And we actually have to convince them that they have a sense of agency and that it's important for them to be involved. And when I think about the things that are effective in helping people learn to be engaged, I think about some of the great work that the Ethics Center has done. So yesterday, Leah and Marcy and Dan and several of the rest of us were in a room, and Lee, when we were hearing students recount their 20 years of Ethics Center fellowships and how doing an Ethics Center fellowship in which they were engaged in social justice work, paid for by the Ethics Center, actually laid the foundation for the work that they are continuing to do today. And I see Jules Bernstein in the audience, who has been supporting World of Work social justice internships. We know that that is one of the mechanisms of things that actually helps people engage in these things. I see Melissa Stamel here, who has been working on the Advocacy for Social Change course that again helps students understand how to be engaged in legislative work. So there are all of these practical things that need to be done, including coursework. So we've just gone through a process of revising our general education requirements. And the whole point of that, although it wasn't always well understood by everyone, is that we believe that civic engagement and learning the skills that are needed to be civically engaged is an essential part of the Brandeis education. And we believe there are certain knowledge areas, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion studies in the US, and difference and justice in the world, that students all have to learn about in order to be civically engaged. Now, one of the things that I think is that we actually have to be teaching students about the deep inequalities that exist in the world, what Maria Madison was talking about, how our democracy has excluded so many people, and how our current economic conditions continue to exclude so many people. And not only do they need to learn about this, we need to instill a lifelong curiosity and commitment to learning about these things after they leave the university. So these are, you know, and I think we actually have to think about how good a job are we actually doing right now? How many of our students are, and I look at the whole entire population of Brandeis, and I think about things like wonderful events that we have in which, you know, you see what percentage of the population is coming to engage in those things. What percentage of students are taking certain courses, are majoring in certain subject matters that are really going to help them understand these issues. Because there is a fear in our American society today. And one of the fears that students who come to Brandeis also experience is, you know, their own futures. They worry about whether or not they are going to be able to have the kind of futures that they themselves have experienced, whether their children are going to have a future that is not endangered by, which it already is, by climate change, terrorism, economic inequality. And so they're often worrying, what kind of career am I going to have that is going to help me be secure and help my family be secure? And these are completely understandable concerns, but we also want to help them understand how, no matter what jobs they take, how they can continue to be civically engaged. And I think we need to consider how we're going to instill that commitment to them. I honestly do believe that, you know, aside from creating the infrastructure and all of the things, we need to be messengers. I see faculty and staff here and other members of our community. And as we are explaining what general education is, and as we're talking about the goals of the university, we really need to be helping students understand how important this is to us as an institution. We need to be talking about it in many different locations, because you can't tell students a message once and assume that they've all absorbed it and are going to continue to work on that. So I probably had a couple of other points, but I'm also mindful that I haven't been as pithy as Dan would have liked me to be, and finish my comments in 2 to 3 minutes. So,
thank you, Elaine. It's a great collection of important topics, and you raised something that, you know, may continue to come up, which is this question of all these things that we would like to do well. How well do we know? How good a job are we actually doing? Do we really ask ourselves the tough questions about evaluating? This is a general problem for higher education, but maybe in this area, it's an area where it's even more challenging for us to do it, and we sometimes kind of duck and say, well, you really won't know for another 30 years as we see how the Sorensen Fellows are doing great work. But I think this question of how we know how well we're doing is intimately related to how well we can actually do, because we have to be better at asking those questions. Leah, did you want to weigh in on this on the student issue of this in relation to students in particular, or you want to wait for now?
I could wait for now.
Okay, great.
I'll just say that, you know, as part of one of the things that we've talked about, it's setting goals, it's setting the measurement of those goals, and then figuring out whether or not, the only reason you assess stuff is so you can improve it.
Go ahead, Anfa. Yeah.
Regarding the role of the students, perhaps the university has to acknowledge that its biggest resource is the students. And the students have a lot of answers and have a connection with the outside world that can be very helpful. For instance, Jacob talked a minute ago about, if I understood you well, it's not just my education. What happens with, I mean, how do we understand education in a more wider scheme than just me becoming a successful professional and making lots of money and pretending that I'm secure? It's important to know that no one is secure anymore in the world. And security is something that education is not going to give us anymore, because what we are doing with the environment, the unethical relationship with the environment, with the society, with the inequality, is making all of us very insecure. And I think, you know, positions like that, or what you say, you know, this has to be connected to high school education to the education of, so education is bigger than career. It's much bigger than that, and it's society that needs to get there. And university has all the students to help them think about it. For instance, what Jacob said, if we thought about what kids can do with technology, and we took that seriously, they can do with technology things that we have never thought possible. And maybe universities need to listen more to students and to the capacities they are bringing into the learning environments, and to how would they respond to make a course and work with high school students, and through technology understand that a class is much more than getting a package of knowledge, and how do we actually make that a tool to educate society in whatever values we are talking about, or what I really think is and in particular from ethics center, the fact that an ethic relationship to the world is much more important than the values we can teach. If we get students, or the university gets students to have actually an ethical positioning towards the world, they will be elements of change. Not wherever we think they have to go, but where they find their path to be, but from an ethical set of tools, and that probably will be their the best experience for their careers if they left the university having already done something to change the world, as opposed to getting prepared to whatever is going to happen later.
Jacob, do we do a good enough job of turning over the learning process to students themselves? Is this something we do reasonably well, or do you think, are there specific ways you think that you would follow up on what Angela has just said?
I think it's a hard question to ask. It's about how frequently students feel that they have the ability to take a seat and to sort of take control of their own education. There's an expression I like to borrow, which is that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And whether or not people can have that seat at the table, it's incumbent upon universities to offer it up to those with potential, to offer it up to those who may not at the moment feel the drive to take it. Some people need to be asked multiple times if they want to. There's a statistic that women have to be asked something like 6 times if they want to run for office before they think about it seriously, whereas with men it's only once. I think the role of the university isn't to instruct students as to what they ought to be most engaged on. It's to instruct students, here is your opportunity to be engaged. Here are the tools that you need. You are capable of doing this. Take the lead.
Elaine?
I'm cautious or concerned not to seem to know enough about what's going on here. But one of the references that struck me in previous comments was a reference to the posse groups that have come to campus. I notice also there's no reference to the Chinese students who have come to campus. It occurs to me, although very different, that one of the programmatic possibilities that may or may not exist, but if it doesn't, maybe should, is for people in these cluster groups to be able to be a resource, to be bringing the information about their hometowns. I had the fortunate experience of now several years of conversation with a fabulous young woman from Atlanta who's part of that posse group. And I know that she and some of her peers are perfectly capable of telling you what's going on in that city with all of its issues of development and inequality and demographic changes and so forth. Someone could, I'm sure, it's too bad you're leaving, Someone, I'm sure, could help structure a kind of curriculum that would help people be a teacher about their own lives and their own communities in a way that would benefit the rest of the community. It also strikes me that there's been interesting work dealing with immigrants into Waltham. I had a conversation recently also with one of the cab drivers who took me to the airport, who can talk about the history of Waltham and point up and down the street to changes that he's not threatened by but is very sensitive to. And with the work that was done that I'm aware of, looking at the lives of these new populations in this old town, I don't think I've seen any work being done on the population that's been there historically and what is going on in their lives and what could be learned cross-culturally in that sense. So it's possible there are some very small but very real kinds of pragmatic uses of student knowledge, which is different from saying how are they going to help make university policy or, you know, change the nature of the degree, but to be talking to each other about what they know and what the rest of us need to know.
So it occurs to me that we're talking about Brandeis as though Brandeis is an institution all by itself. And I think that, in fact, it would make a lot of sense for Brandeis and other small or medium-sized liberal arts colleges and universities to be talking about this together. Because I do not think that this is an issue, obviously, we're not facing this just by ourselves. But I also think that's a way of gathering, first defining what we think the problems are. We spent some time here trying to do that, and I think it's actually a big challenge to describe what and define what the problems are, but also then to get together with different resources and to have a voice nationally that I think it's very, unless you're Harvard, it's very hard for one university to have a voice which stands out there. The Carnegie Association for the Advancement of Teaching in the West Coast is very interested in having a network of, instead of a change going this way and coming up this way, thinking about a network of people who and institutions that work together. And I think this is really hard stuff, folks. And it's going to take a tremendous amount of work. And people at Brandeis, I've noticed, already are working pretty hard. So I think that part of what we need to do is share some of this in a certain way and maybe get a foundation to put out some money with people to think about this together. And it very well may be that it will be different. What we end up doing might be very different by each university and college. And I don't think there's only one thing to do.
And sorry, Maria, what exactly is the this?
This is, what is the role of higher education at a time when democracy is being challenged and at a time when the demographics are changing in our country? So I would make it, democracy is being challenged, demographics are changing rapidly, and we know there's a response to that, and when there's so much inequality as well. I mean, I think you have to ask the question in a complicated enough way that you can get to the answers of what you want to do, but that if university, even if Brandeis started, if universities did this together, we might be surprised at the kind of imaginative answers and power that we would have.
Okay, that's if we don't solve everything in the next 45 minutes.
Right.
Jay?
First of all, let me build on what Maria just said. I think that
Mike, can you
what I
put the
agree.
mic?
I'm sorry.
Mike.
Thank you. I think defining the problem is going to take the first couple of years. And I have a slightly different formulation of that, of what I think is the same thing in my notes here, which is that part of what needs to change is a sense of modesty. Since we don't know what the problems are, we have to stop pretending that we do, and we have to stop pretending that we are the experts. And I think the model of education still, not so much at Brandeis, but in general in the educational world, is still there's somebody who knows what they're doing, teaching people who are the uninitiated. That's a model whose time has passed, and so we need to be a little bit more modest about what we're doing on the college campuses, and that's going to take a little bit of work. That's a major transformation. Secondly, in terms of civic engagement, I think we have to model it, not just talk about it or teach it. That means a lot of transparency, a lot of accountability, a lot of mea culpas where we make mistakes. Again, this campus has been pretty decent about some of it, but we need to do more. And pulling back the curtains on who's making decisions and how decisions are made is going to be very important. And then making sure that we're giving our students full responsibility for their learning. We can't teach them if they're not willing to learn. And part of what I learned here as an undergraduate and have tried to practice ever since takes its form in the application process that I have for staff. So after interviewing staff, I want to make sure they know how to write. So I give them an overnight writing assignment, and I give them 3 prompts, 3 questions to consider, and they can pick any one of those 3. Or if they don't like those questions, they can make up their own question and answer it. Because I want them to own what it is they're doing. I don't want to tell them what to do. And I think in some ways we have to think about our classrooms as engaging students in that kind of way, so that they're helping us frame the question, since we can't really claim to know them all.
Lisa, did I hear maybe a wave in response to Jay's comment on expertise? No? Oh, it was from you?
No, a small comment. Jay, I agree with much of what you've just outlined, but I'd make a distinction, which is always a dangerous thing to do once you've agreed with somebody, then to distinguish what what they've said from what you hope they didn't say. So I think that the opening of the university to and the full interaction between the university and the society is a given, although the old model certainly didn't have it that way. I would agree with you completely. And I don't think we've figured out how to make the new model work. I think that's a lot of the theme of this discussion here. How does the university open itself, not just its doors to people coming in from the outside, but its thinking and its minds and all of that. So that's really critical, and I'd like to hear more discussion of that. However, the one piece of it where I would make the distinction is I do, and maybe this is very old-fashioned of me, I do believe that there is such a thing as expertise. Sometimes it is pretentious and elite and gets in the way of real communication. But we're living in an era where expertise is so denigrated, and it is the subject, it is the target of much of this. We've tried to find the right word for it. I've been using the term populism. Others have used other stronger terms, but it's the target of all of that. And I think if we allow it to become truly a target, then we're going to fall prey to the very thing that we're trying to open ourselves up to. So in that sense, I will defend the university as a center of expert thinking, recognizing fully that there may be people who are not particularly expert, or who are indeed quite the opposite and are pretending to be expert and who have no role to play with the society. But we have to take that risk. Otherwise, we lose really the essence of what a university is. So I would say engagement, yes, but expertise, yes, as well.
I fully accept that distinction. I agree.
Gordie?
Yeah, I'm just thinking one thing we could do. We talk about social justice a lot, and we mean it. There's a history here that I think is lost for a lot of the students. I go back a long, long way. 1969, black students took over what was then Ford Hall. there was a major event, and out of that came some major changes in the university. In 1970, the National Student Strike against the war in Vietnam was headquartered at Brandeis. It involved about a quarter of the campuses all over the country. Students did fantastic things. The faculty ended the semester 11 days early so the students who wanted to work on the war effort could, all right? There were 2 faculty who supported the war, and the rest of us didn't. That's 69 and 70. In the 70s, we had a divestment movement, divestment from South Africa. There was some slide back from that, and we had another movement more powerful in the 80s, which did wind up with Brandeis fully divesting. And then coming up now on March 24th is a national student movement on responding to Parkland, right? There's a lot going on, and I think I've never been involved in first-year orientation, but I think students ought to know about these things. They should know the history of this place as one of an activist thrust repeatedly, and that there's an honor in maintaining that and understanding it. My hope, which is probably naive, but I feel hopeful anyway, is that the March 24th thing will be, for the first time since the student movement against the war in Vietnam, a coming together of people from all over the country saying, okay, that's enough. Isn't that their motto, I think, that never again, or that's enough, or something? And students may finally get to the point where they see there used to be national student associations. I don't think there are anymore. Are there, Jacob? Is there anything that brings students, leaders from all over the country together?
It's
not much, yeah. Anyway, I think there's a demographic that has fantastic political potential, and it would be thrilling to see it develop.
Great. Lisa and Leah were both kind of waving here.
Leah, you go first.
No, okay, yeah, you'll probably want to respond to what I have to say anyway. I think what Jay was speaking about in regards to modeling is something that really resonated with me, that our institutions and our administration needs to be modeling the type of engagement in democracy and leadership that we want our students to take. And really pulling back the curtains on who is making decisions. But from what I've seen is being a leader in different organizing efforts at Brandeis, and unfortunately from the perspective of other students, is that I don't think university administrations can continue to be painted as the enemy or the man or the oppressor or silencer of student voices. Instead, I think that university administrations need to encourage the democratic and political action that we are saying on this panel students need to be engaging in, and also needing to embrace this action that is already being led by Brandeis students. So right now, I think students perceive the university, or the administration at least, as a political entity rather than a body that is necessarily encouraging active democracy or engagement in our world. For example, that could be taken in the case of climate justice or Fort Hall, as Professor Fellman mentioned. And so what I'm wondering is, how can we encourage political engagement and democracy when the students perceive the university administration as shutting down both our voices and students themselves when it comes to students acting for all of these virtues and justice that we're all speaking about today.
Good thing she went first.
Yeah, well, I had a feeling. So Gordie, as you went through your list, and Leah, I'm glad you raised that, I would have added a very important moment at this university, which was Fort Hall 2015. Yeah, I won't forget. Having actually had the honor and the responsibility of being the man or the administration at that moment in time, I think a couple of things that are for me were really important during the student occupation of the administration building in November into December of 2015. First, that came out from a wider discussion that our campus had been involved in of Black Lives Matter, and a discussion that for this university was particularly difficult for us to engage in. as a university that prided ourselves with our deep commitment and roots in history and social justice, I think we had a hard time, not just the administration, but more broadly the entire university, in confronting our own failure to truly accomplish an inclusive university where all of our students felt that they were able to engage in learning and activity and had voice and representation in the university. So it was a journey that not only the administration, I would argue, not only administration had to go through, but also our students, our staff, and our faculty. And one of the things that I did when I spoke to the faculty during the occupation was that I urged various departments and faculty members to collectively commit themselves publicly to the changes that they were going to undertake to create a more inclusive community in which people were more empowered to A, raise their voice, and B, determine their path and future at the university. It's to the point that we had over 40 statements that were posted, and they were posted on the president's webpage all over the university. So this was not something in which we were trying to tap down, but instead to raise up in the university. And I think it was actually, as difficult a moment as it was, we ended up in a good place. I also want to highlight that during that process, the students who were on the student negotiation team were all women, and on the administration team, all but one were women. And that was a very different Ford Hall than the Ford Hall of 1969.
All the leaders were men.
All of them on both sides. And I think that this is a big change. And I think, again, we talked about it as a group during the negotiations about the fact that we were majority women that were engaging in the discussion. So the way that we even did the negotiations was different. We would begin with meditation and yoga before we would start the negotiations. I somehow or other very much doubt that in 1969 that this was the way in which people engaged. But it was a way of also trying to center ourselves, to form a bond as a community. And again, I think so how we are learning, even at the most difficult moments, I think that was terrific. Now, having said that, I think that, in my own view, I think that we've made progress, but I think we've lost some of that sense of urgency. And, it's how we leverage on each issue that comes forward to us to reestablish that sense of urgency and that need to pull together, not sort of leaning in individually, but this collective action. That's really the only way that we're going to make fundamental changes.
Thank you. Raj, in turning to you, I also want to, you may have a lot of other things you're raising, but I want to just bring in that we also want to think about in the time we have left, as we think about the things that the universities can and should be doing, the pressures that are on universities from outside, the question of whether universities are under threat in terms of freedom of expression on their campus from outside constituencies, to what extent rising nationalism is threatening the flow of our students across borders, and something that John mentioned earlier and others, the general anti-intellectual climate outside, or that Jay also mentioned, and the extent to which that is a threat to us. I know you may not be taking any of those on, but I want to raise some of those so that they are part of our conversation.
Is this a segue into the next block of questions? Then? Okay. Well, I just want to quickly, I'll keep it to 2 minutes, preface my remarks about that section with student empowerment, Angela's remarks about us being a function of society, Lisa on administrative leadership and the fluidity of borders, but then John's discussion about the responsibility of science production, the nature of knowledge production. There's no doubt that universities are sites of transformation, and it is global, to move to that conversation. Universities in India, where you see women rising up for the first time protesting what they're seeing as the rape culture or the failure of the state to protect women, basic rights, fighting misogynistic culture. You see Hong Kong students in universities trying to recapture what they might think of as democratic autonomy within a new imperial Chinese sovereignty. So universities have always been sites of protest. But to John's perspective, and how does the internationalization of Western universities complicate this? I appreciate what you said, Lisa, when scientists, there's no simple boundary between apolitical scientists. Many of our scientists, many scientists around the country, are fundamentally about social justice, especially on climate change issues, of which they have the expertise to offer. It's political within their process. So we have to be careful about separating the pursuit, as I said, of truth and scientific knowledge from the demands of the university. Having said that, getting to the diversity issues, let's just start with the domestic. There's a fundamental difference between academic responsibility of how you talk about things in the classroom that can cause harm with enabling student clubs to be able to invite speakers of any kind just because of the defense of their free speech to bring controversial speakers to the campus without worrying about the collateral damage it can cause. And Dershowitz had an interesting perspective when he weighed in, and he said, you know what, it'd be profoundly stupid if, in this day and age, a university, tier 1 research university in a history department hired an anti-Holocaust person because historical evidence just doesn't back it up. You'd be pretty stupid to do that. If a kid with a club wanted to bring in an anti-Holocaust or a Holocaust denier speaker and have some, public support for that somehow without the university endorsing that speaker, in principle, free speech would allow for that to occur. Those are kind of like polarizing issues that can really get the community to debate. But let's nuance that a bit with diversity. And we'll look at the domestic diversity issue and now the internationalization and globalization, particularly, let's say, the rise of a lot of Chinese nationals who are 70 to 80%, I believe, of our international students. And then the top sending countries, quite frankly, are mostly Asian and Nigeria. What if students of color in the American context, whether they're in the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, the professional schools, say, we have a different vision about the nature of oppression in higher education. And we're not talking about just the empirical fact of the lack of diversity in the faculty or staff and the growing diversity of the student body, but the lack of empowerment about the things they want to talk about. And we want to use the word white supremacy and tell the institution or tell the predominantly white faculty that there is something called white supremacy in higher education. And let's say you have an older faculty member from a different generation saying, what are they talking about? How can you prove that such a thing exists scientifically? I don't see the KKK running around. I don't see racial slurs or intentional acts of discrimination. So what are they talking about? What do they mean by the institutional nature of oppression? Therein lies an impasse between the ethical responsibility to respond to them and John's perspective, which is the preponderance that we all exist by a reasonable and rational standard in the law, if you want to use that, but the scientific method, which is to question all assumptions until we arrive at some consensual understanding of the representation of truth. So I bring it back to the fact that, as Mario was saying, there is seemingly a divergence of priorities between the equality of everybody's experiences, the increasing diversification, but I'd say the increasing justification for the way we produce knowledge. It's verified and justified that we can be able to put forward knowledge even if it goes against the grain of what the outside world is peddling as knowledge or anti-knowledge, which is coming from the populism that John talked about. And what I do struggle with in terms of the social justice mission, I'll end here, is there's an overwhelming intention to American diversity because our society is diversifying and intersectionally. What that means is people of color who are also LGBTQ. But your question, Dan, was that we have an international population. We have people that live between the boundaries of the domestic and the international, migrants, refugees, the DACA crisis that Lisa and the administration has to face, given what's coming from the larger political realm. So we have to get used to this fluidity that Western universities no longer exist in the Western world per se. They don't just serve Western populations. They're global by nature. They're intrinsically global. And groups have their own pressure points. There are real concerns, I would imagine, coming to your office, Lisa, of international students living in fear. Yep. And if you don't tell me for a second, like Gordie was saying, the inspiration of the Parkland kids, You think about the crucible here. 15-year-olds, and some of you may have them, are protesting for their right to live just by going to school. That's an extreme pathological manifestation of this society. You can telescope that into higher education. How do you do that? Well, there are people that live in fear. And at the same time, we're trying to get an education. And that needs to be the horizon by which we continue to do what we do with a fair amount of ethical responsibility, just as if the world were somehow less dislocated or less fearful. But I would say from an ethical perspective, we do have this fiduciary responsibility to protect those that might perceive harm or danger as imminent. And it crosses boundaries because it's not just about nuclear bombs and terrorists. It's about something called racism or sexism or homophobia. And those are just as exigent as any external threat that we might face in the world.
Thank you. That's a lot there for us to unpack, Raj. I'm going to give a chance for those in the audience, some of whom have been sitting patiently for a long time. Jules Bernstein, I know you wanted to make some comments as a member of our center's board and somebody engaged in some of the labor issues, workers' rights issues that we discussed earlier in the day.
Thanks, Dan. First, let me say to Gordie, I stepped onto this campus in 1953 as an 18-year-old, and so I got a couple of years on you, and in that department, and maybe otherwise too. But I think, remember, TYP, the African American Department, the Waltham Group, Posse, DEIS Impact. It's not as if this university has been indifferent to change or doing important new things. And so there's continuity in addressing these kinds of questions. Now, Louis Brandeis, as some of you know, has made a tremendous impression on this university and me. And I don't like to be a spoilsport, folks, but Louis said, we must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. Now, if you look at the work of Thomas Piketty, you will see that day by day, the inequality gets worse. So Mr. Bezos, he's now the world's richest guy based upon Amazon and so forth. That happened pretty quickly. So the concentration of wealth at the top by a few is really a major problem which nobody discussed today. And maybe the reason for that is nobody has an idea about what to do about it. So just let's put that one down. Secondly, Louis said the most important public office is that of a private citizen. And I thought about that this summer, and I said, I looked at the Constitution, First Amendment, talked about a petition for redress of grievances. And I went into the history of that, went back to the Magna Carta. And every citizen has the right to petition. This is in addition to the First Amendment. That is to say, you can't interfere with one's right to petition for a redress of grievances. And so I decided to do that. And so if you go to censuredonaldtrump.com, you will see that I have 40 grounds for censure there and 60,000 signatures. So each of us can do something. And when I started this, I never dreamt that I'd have as many signatures or that he would generate 40, and there's a new one just I'm putting on right now, when he called Maxine Waters an idiot or a low IQ individual, which he did the other day. This is an outrage. And I am outraged that more people are outraged about this guy. So, and that gets me to my last point. I have been a lawyer for a long time, and I have enjoyed being a lawyer. It's one of the great, things that one can be for me. But when we had Watergate, the legal profession in this country stood up, and basically when Ruckelshaus was fired and other things happened, the legal profession came forward and stood up for the rule of law, Your Honor. That is to say, the rule of law is critical to our society. The legal profession today has been silenced. There are 1.4 million lawyers in this country, but you don't hear a united voice of the legal profession being outraged and speaking up. And we'll see whether they do anything at the American Bar Association convention in August about Trump. So far, silence. And that is because, in my estimation, the legal profession has been compromised and it's become a business instead of an honored profession. So those are a few items that I don't think we addressed here today, but go into the mix.
Jules, quick question. Universities have spoken up with regard to specific Trump administration policies, like on immigration, Brandeis among others. But should university officials sign your petition to censure the president, specifically on this whole list of grounds, because democratic values are at stake? Or should they withhold because in signing that they're entering as partisans in a debate that might threaten the free exchange of ideas within the university?
There's no question that they should sign. I mean, there is just no question. I mean, this has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. This is, you're signing against tyranny. And if you're going to say I can't speak out against tyranny because that might be partisan, then we're lost. So that's where I'm coming from. And I've had journalists who said, oh, Jules, I like your petition, but I can't sign it. I'm a journalist. I have to be objective. Where are we? If that's the way things are. So this is an all-out struggle, I see. And I'm not as sanguine as some friends are. I had a major union leader say to me within the last couple of weeks, oh, we'll let Mueller take care of Trump. Not me. Then I think Manafort is waiting to get pardoned. That's why he hasn't copped a plea. And we have a tyrant sitting in the White House. And let's all acknowledge it and do something about it. And there's much that can be done.
All right. An interesting debate, perhaps, for the future. Before I'm going to see if anybody else from the audience wants to speak, I'd like to put the panel up here on notice that I'd like you to each think about a one-sentence, not summary, but something when we look back at this tape later on, I'd love to be able to look at the last 2 minutes and have a sentence from each of you of the things we need most important to think about or act on going forward. A single sentence. We'll have a round in a minute. In the meantime, Lisa, introduce yourself, please.
I'm Lisa Fishbane-Jaffe. I'm the director of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and I have a short question for Justice Goldstone. Reflecting on the different institutions in South Africa that have stood up for the rule of law. You talked about the media, and you talked about the legal profession, and we can see in the context of America that I think those institutions have been doing a good job, particularly on the executive orders around immigration, the legal profession, both individuals and bringing cases to beat back the various versions have been very efficient, successful. Judges have stood up. I have concerns about what's going to happen when we have judges that have been appointed by this administration who are hearing these cases in a few years. But what you didn't talk about in South Africa is the role of the student movement. So it's been the role of the student uprisings, the student movement, because that's been a very lively part of South Africa now. The roads must fall and fees must fall. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit on how the universities there have responded to those movements, how that's been part of the struggle against corruption, and what we can learn from that.
And Richard, if I could ask you to keep your response to that brief. You're always pithy, but we're close to the end of our time.
Well, it's a big topic. I think generally in South Africa, but when I said civil society stood up, I'm talking about human rights organizations, of which there are many, domestic and international, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but more particularly the very successful South African organizations which have stood up. One of my former colleagues on the Constitutional Court, Johan Huchler, set up an organization called Freedom Under Law, and they have in fact brought some important litigation against the Zuma government. So it's come from many sources, and it's increasing because of the attacks on banking institutions, and it really is spreading. It really is spreading a great deal. When it comes to fees must fall and how the universities have stood up and dealt with the problems that students have put to them, is a very mixed bag. And I think here is an area where individuals make a difference. I think some university presidents acted strongly and ethically, and didn't give in to some of the more outlandish demands that have been made. Other university presidents caved in, and fortunately, I think certainly I don't want to have to eat my words next week, but so far the present our university semesters begin at the beginning of February. And this year is probably the least violent and the least problematic that we've had in the last few years. But it's a very difficult area, and I think the university administrations have really struggled against the extremes, which include violence, burning classrooms, and physically preventing students from attending classes. Very difficult issue.
Great, thank you, Richard. Okay, I'm going to turn now to Lee Swigert for to lift up some of the themes from the second half, and then we will conclude by going around and with a single sentence from each of you. And I'm going to start going to my left and go this way to end with John, Lisa. So you'll be first.
All right, thank you, everyone. A little bit less daunting this time because it was not quite so much. All right, there was, again, a real interesting series of comments and a lot of retouching on the same themes or variations of themes. It was pointed out that universities may well need to think about one of their missions to instill lifelong interest and curiosity about civic engagement, starting when they're on campus and moving into their adult life. But it was also pointed out, do we have to cajole students to take these opportunities that are offered to them? Some students are very willing, other ones may not be as willing, and you can't really teach them if they don't want to learn these things. So that's a challenge. It was pointed out also that that we need to think about the role of students in universities and how they are a real resource for the university, that their points of view are really pertinent. They can do a lot to teach older folks about all kinds of issues, including technology, and they might also be quite good in engaging in secondary school students in a way that perhaps professors in higher ed cannot be. So maybe we need to listen to students more. It was suggested that a university like Brandeis, that is rather small, might want to partner in a horizontal way with a number of other institutions of similar size to really be looking at these questions of what is the role of higher education at a time of democratic challenges, at a time of demographic change, and also increasing inequality. we were reminded that, again, universities may have to really step back from their idea of being all-knowing and admit that there are lots of things in this current environment that they cannot know, and they should be open and admit the sort of lack of knowledge and the idea that they have to be searching not only for answers but for the actual questions to ask. But that brought up the idea of, yes, it's good to be open to new kinds of thinking, also to new populations on campus, but we need to remember there is such a thing as expertise, and we don't want to give that up. We don't want to ask too many questions, perhaps, because that could feed into a populist attitude about a denigration of an intellectual class or intellectual elite. To get to a more kind of epistemological question, this has to do with divergence on university campuses between the need for truth and rigor in academic research versus the kind of subjective experiences of students and their ways of viewing what happens on campuses themselves. So this gets to Raj's idea about whether students could potentially say that they see there's a stance of white supremacy in the way that the university experience and structures have been created. We're in a Western university, but we're no longer only serving Western students, so there needs to be a certain kind of intellectual and also, I think, pragmatic kind of fluidity. And we also need to protect students at a moment when they also may be feeling very insecure, whether about their immigration status, about their own personal safety. We were reminded of Brandeis' very long activist history. I think there were questions about where the administration may or may not be willing to partner with students in their activism, although I think it's pretty clear that in the recent past there has been a very tight partnership. And let me just end with this reminder that perhaps we all shouldn't be so intellectual about what's going on now. Maybe we just need to sign on to this resistance against tyranny and challenge to the rule of law.
Lee, thank you so much. That is not easy to do, and to do it twice in 3 hours. That's really a great service, and thank you for your fantastic work, not only on this, but on work on international judges and so many other things that we do. Okay, as promised, one sentence to take our conversation into the future. This is not a sentence from Finnegan's Wake. So we'll move clockwise, starting with Lisa Lynch, and we'll end with John Shattuck.
If we want to protect true democracy, universities need to ensure that the search for truth is not limited to a substrate of individuals on the basis of their wealth and power.
Today's discussion has had a number of references to South Africa and to Central Europe. I find the absence of reference to the state of democracy in Israel is somewhat shocking, and that this university, given its history and the Zionist foundation from Louis Brandeis, ought to be taking some kind of leadership role within the American Jewish community and within the debates back and forth between the United States and Israel about the nature of how one can be Jewish and democratic in that state.
Well, I take a question with me. It's always great to be surrounded by so many smart people. So can the university change the question from what to teach to how to learn from the needs of a specific constituencies and exchange knowledge to promote alternative learning?
If we do not engage beyond our campus, our knowledge and our principle will be lost.
Since most social movements do not mobilize a majority of citizens, I wonder if when we think about mobilizing students to vote, that's a different task than helping to encourage student leaders of movements.
One of the strengths of universities historically has been its ability to be deliberate and careful in its process of change. That may actually be the end of universities as we know them, if they don't take bold and non-incremental steps to push us forward.
Richard.
Well, for my sentence, I rely on the name of this excellent centre. I would say no compromise in public life on ethics or justice.
We cannot reduce the setbacks to democracy to higher education. It must be inclusive of a K-12 education as well.
Say, quoting Victor Hugo, there's nothing greater than an idea when its time has come. We live in a big tent, this is one sentence, it could be a run-on, where our scientists can pursue the quantum gravitational nature of black holes, or our scientists can pursue the cure to cancer, but for us to avoid species-level extinction and climate change and authoritarianism in a diverse world, the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of knowledge and truth are not incompatible.
And to that point, I'll bring Sarah into the conversation, the daughter of a colleague who came here as a potential applicant, completely disgusted with the campus touring that her parents were making her do, walked out of the tour and discussion about Brandeis in tears, so moved by the commitment, the DNA, the passion here for social and economic justice and pursuing difficult questions.
I have a question. Should one of our goals be ascertaining the specific ways in which we can ensure that the vast majority of not only Brandeis alum, but graduates of other institutions of higher learning, both in the United States and elsewhere, leave the university with a deeper understanding of the inequalities that exist in the world and a commitment to civic engagement to addressing them?
I want to pick up on something Jules brought up. The Koch brothers financed the Tea Party. The Tea Party begat Donald Trump. I think until we get to that financing of our political system through Citizens United especially, we're doomed. We cannot let these people, the Koch brothers have a long, several years strategy which is working through all kinds of institutions to kind of take over, and I think we haven't paid enough attention to that.
Democracy is only as resilient as the people in it, and there comes a moment when the people need to act to protect the democracy. We have had such a moment in the past. I would mention Richard Nixon in that regard. There is a role, these are a lot of semicolons, but I'm about to end.
Run-on sentences,
there is a role for lawyers, there is a role for educators, there is a role for everyone. And that role is to stand up and be heard in defense of democracy.
Folks, this is one of the things that we do, bring together smart, impassioned folks to bring forward the ideas that push us on to think better, to think deeper, to act better, to act more effectively. And so we've been doing that for 20 years, and I hope we'll be doing it for 20 or 40 or 100 more. So please join me in thanking this extraordinary group of folks. And please come join us. The celebration continues in the lobby of the atrium of the Abraham Shapiro Academic